Once upon a time in a far-off land, there lived an orphan girl who never knew her parents. She grew up under the loving care of her kind-hearted cousin Mordecai. One day she was chosen to be the queen of Persia, but that came with a deadly challenge. Soon she had to decide whether to risk her life to save her people or let them all be destroyed. How did she get out of this impossible situation?
Ho, ho, ho!
Let's find out in today's episode of Once Upon a Time. In today's story, we meet an orphan girl who never knew her parents. She grew up under the loving care of her dear cousin Mordecai. Now, she was a beautiful girl with a heart of gold. But despite her beauty, no one ever asked her hand in marriage. Why? Because she was just a lowly orphan. Now, King Artaxerxes of Persia was in search of a new queen.
Ho, ho, ho!
And so he organized a grand competition, inviting all the eligible maidens from around the kingdom. But when it was time for Hadassah, also called Esther, to participate, her cousin Mordecai told her not to go. He feared something bad might happen to her. But she replied, "Who knows if I have been made queen for such a time as this?" And so she went to the competition. The king was immediately taken by Esther's beauty and grace.
Ho, ho, ho!
And without wasting any more time, he made her the queen of Persia and invited her to his grand palace. But there was already someone living in the palace whom the king had given all the authority to rule over the kingdom. That person was none other than the king's close friend, Haman. You see, Haman hated Mordecai because he didn't bow down to him.
Ho, ho, ho!
And so he started planning a dark plot to take revenge on Mordecai and all the Jews living in the kingdom. Meanwhile, after becoming the queen, Esther still lived a life of humility and served her people. In the evenings, she would come to Mordecai's house and discuss everything with him. One day Mordecai told Esther about Haman's wicked plot, but she didn't believe him. Instead, she told him to go and ask the king directly.
Ho, ho, ho!
But he replied, "You know the king won't even accept my petition." Then she said, "Go and fast along with me for 3 days. Then I will go to the king and ask him whatever you want." And so they fasted and prayed for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her finest garments and approached the king's throne, even though she wasn't invited. She knew that if the king didn't recognize her, his guards would kill her on the spot.
Ho, ho, ho!
However, when she stood before the king, he immediately recognized his beloved wife and extended his golden scepter towards her. This showed that he was ready to listen to whatever she had to say. Then she invited the king and Haman to her house for dinner. And while they were enjoying the feast, she told the king how Haman had insulted her and the Jews. At first, the king didn't believe her, but then Haman confirmed it.
Ho, ho, ho!
And so the king got very angry and asked them to leave. Then he went to his royal advisers and told them what Haman had done. They all agreed that Haman should be put to death. And so the king took off his ring, which symbolized his authority, and gave it to Mordecai instead. That's when Mordecai realized that God had saved his people through Esther.
Ho, ho, ho!
Meanwhile, Haman was dragged to the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And at last, justice was served. In the end, the Jews were saved from destruction, and they celebrated their deliverance for 8 days. They called this holiday Purim, meaning lots, because God had saved them by casting the lots for Queen Esther to win the competition. Let us now look at some important lessons from the story.
Ho, ho, ho!
First, we see that God has a plan for everyone's life. When Esther won the competition, she thought it was just luck. But later she understood that God had placed her in the palace for such a time as this. So, like Esther, we too need to trust that God has a purpose for our lives, even if we don't understand it right away. Second, we see that sometimes God calls us to do things that seem impossible.
Ho, ho, ho!
When Mordecai asked Esther to become queen, she put her life at risk. Similarly, when Esther asked the king to come to her house, she didn't know if the king would even recognize her. So when God calls us to do something that seems scary, we must remember that He will be with us every step of the way. Third, we see that God can use anyone to accomplish His purpose. When Esther became queen, she used her position to help her people.
Ho, ho, ho!
Likewise, we should remember that God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies those He calls. So if God has placed you in a certain situation, it's because He wants to use you to accomplish His purpose. Fourth, we see that God's timing is perfect. When Esther and Mordecai decided to fast, they didn't know that God was working behind the scenes to expose Haman's evil plot. So we need to trust that God's timing is always perfect.
Ho, ho, ho!
Just like He delivered the Jews from destruction, He will also deliver us from all our troubles in His perfect timing. Fifth, we see that courage is important to fulfill God's purpose. When Esther decided to approach the king without being invited, she showed great courage. Likewise, we too may face situations where we need to be brave and take risks to fulfill God's purpose. Now let us recall the main points of the story.
Ho, ho, ho!
Esther was an orphan girl who grew up under the care of her cousin Mordecai. She was chosen to be the queen of Persia, but that came with a dark plot by Haman, who wanted to destroy her nation. Esther fasted and prayed for 3 days before approaching the king without being invited. The king spared her life and listened to her as she exposed Haman's evil plot.
Ho, ho, ho!
Her bravery saved her nation, and they celebrated their deliverance for 8 days, calling it Purim. And finally, here are some questions for you to ponder upon. What qualities do you admire in Esther? How does the story of Esther give you hope in difficult times? And how can you apply the lessons from the story in your own life? As we close today's story, I want you to remember that no matter what challenges you may face in life,
Ho, ho, ho!
God is with you every step of the way. Just like He delivered Esther and her people from destruction, He will also deliver you from all your troubles. So hold on to God's promises and trust in His perfect timing. We hope you enjoyed listening to the story of Esther. If you did, please hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to never miss out on our amazing stories.
Ho, ho, ho!
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Ho, ho, ho!